Part two, part two here is security and compliance. This is a very, in our revision, security is an area that, yeah, we remember the score here was always low at the beginning, though there was some improvement. But I just want to make sure everyone also try to take a key note of what is covered in this area. So security and compliance, what you are expected to know is to define the AWS shared responsibility model, define AWS cloud security and compliance concepts, identify AWS access management capabilities and resources, and then identify resources for security support. So what here, shared responsibility model. So security and compliance is a shared responsibility between AWS and the customer. That's something we've talked on that. It help customers, it help relieve the customer's operational burden. And when you talk of, so AWS will be managing and controlling the components, that's from the host operation system virtualization layer down to the physical security of the facilities. So you don't bother about the data centers, they're in charge of how secure they are. And the customers then focuses on managing the guest operating system in case if they're using the IA infrastructure as a service and other associated application. You see how these things come together. If you understand the types of cloud computing, you will be able to understand the shared responsibility model very well, because the types of cloud computing, they actually show where the responsibility of the customer ends and the responsibility of the of the provider ends as well. So where that starts and ends for each of those, be it the customer or be it the provider, in this case AWS. So there are two distinct layers when you talk of shared responsibility. We've talked of security of the cloud, which is done by AWS. You have access and training for Amazon employees, global data centers and underlying network. You have a network running from, remember AWS is just a global network. So you have fiber cables running from USA to Europe, running right down to South Africa and to Asia. This is not your responsibility. AWS is in charge of that underlying network. Hardware for global infrastructure, so the different data centers. Configuration management for infrastructure. So configuring the data centers to be able to have the host, let's say, when you're talking of virtualization, which enables the creation of EC2 instances, the management of all the configuration management of those hosts is not carried by you, it's carried by AWS. And then patching of those hosts themselves, because remember, virtualization still run under an underlying host, and they have to be patched and the cloud infrastructure, as well as any services that AWS is providing, maintaining them is the work for AWS. So security of the cloud is carried by AWS. And I want you to take note of training. You notice I have training there in bold, because when you are looking at the second layer, which is security in the cloud, you still have training coming up. So individual access to cloud resources and training, that is done by the customer. So if I want to access cloud resources, um, yeah, that has to be done. That is part of the security of accessing. So like you have your account, right? To make that account secure is my responsibility. And training the people that may be in a particular department, how to use AWS resources and in a secure manner. That is done by the customer. Then data security and encryption, both transit and at rest. Yes, we've talked about when data, trying to ensure that data is encrypted. That's why we have different encryption models that we've mentioned sometime earlier. That's supposed to be handled by the customer. Then operating system, network and firewall configurations. Yeah, when you are thinking of security groups, yeah, if you are thinking of managing the operating system, here is the guest operating system. And all code deployed onto the cloud infrastructure, patching the guest OS and custom applications. So those are areas that the customer is then in charge of. Um, then this diagram is this graph is very important, which goes to show where all of that ends. And if you look very well, if you're looking at AWS, that's responsibility and security of the cloud, regions, availability zones, edge locations, hardware and AWS global infrastructure, compute, storage, database, networking, and the software. All of this is handled by AWS. On the customer side, I think we have seen areas where they mention this is now security in the cloud, client-side data encryption and data integrity and authentication. I would say if people can capture this graph on their minds, they will do lots of good, because we have seen questions asking about the response, which one is the responsibility of AWS and which one is the responsibility of the customer. And it requires that if you have a good understanding of this diagram, you're quite on the good side. Many questions in our revision hang around here, and I've emphasized that it doesn't mean you should just know these two. Also take good note that networking traffic protection, encryption, integrity, and identity is also part of the customer. Then the operating system here, which is the guest operating system, network and firewall configuration, platform, identity and access management, and customer data is handled by you, the customer. Then this is a very important area, identity and access management. It enables you to manage access to AWS services and resources securely. Now, using IAM, you can create and manage AWS users and groups and use permissions to allow and deny their access to AWS resources. Remember, this is offered at no additional charge. And I think one thing I left out there is a global service. It's actually a global service. So um, here you create and manage AWS users and groups using the IMI. Let's define a user. A user is an entity or an identity that you create in AWS to represent the person or application that uses it to interact with AWS. So when you go to AWS, like when you create your account, first of all, you always create it using your Gmail, and then you have access to that account. And we know that becomes like the root account, but we know it's not advisable to use that. So when you create another user, that's what is referred to as an IMI user. And in this case, with an IMI user, so anyone who has access to that account, so when you create an IMI user, anyone who has access to that account will be able to interact with AWS services for that account. So it represents, that's why it says it represents a person or an application. Why an application? Because you can also download, an IMI user always have identity, always have access keys. If you download the access keys that are associated with an IMI user and give it to an application, that application will be able to interact with your AWS service. As an example here, which I can give is like, for those who maybe have tried Terraform. Terraform is an application similar to CloudFormation for infrastructure as code. To be able to run, to allow Terraform access AWS account, you have to give Terraform access keys, so that whoever is then working and interacting with Terraform, those keys will allow that application access AWS. So even without knowing Terraform, but I was just giving that as an example, but just know that if you have an application that wants to access AWS, you can then do that. And I'm stressing here because we have also come across where they are trying to figure out, do you understand when you talk of IMI user, do you understand that access keys are associated to an IMI user? because they will give a question and maybe they list other things, but the key thing they are trying to look like, always remember that an IMI user is associated to, access keys are associated to an IMI user. And, and they control authentication and authorization. And these keys for IMI user are permanent keys. We are going to come to another case where we'll have temporary keys. So the key things to know about an IMI user is, yeah, they have permanent keys and they represent a person and application that want to interact. Then a group is a collection of IMI users. Why would you want to do that? User groups let you specify permissions for multiple users. So there will be no need to, let's say, if you have 100 users and all of them are supposed to have the same permission, trying to give those permissions to those 100 users individually is a burden. So what you can do is you can put them all under one group and you take an permissions and put them into that group and all of them will inherit it. So the key thing you should know for groups is that it's just a collection of multiple users and it makes it easy to manage the permissions for those users. It simplifies, groups simplify security. I did talk about, let's look at IMI role here. An identity with permission policies that determine what the identity can and cannot do in AWS, and make sure that you pick this out. Roles have temporary keys, while an IMI user have permanent keys. Roles have temporary keys. Um, you use an IMI role when you want users or services to assume a particular role, and this is done through the access keys. You know, the access keys, they always grant the entity here could be a person, could be an application, permissions that are assigned to the role. So rules always, IMI rules always come with some specific permissions. And any application or any user who can assume, who can have, who has that role attached to it, I would then inherit the permissions that are on that 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 are attached to that role. So an example of when you can use an IMI role is, imagine you have Amazon EC2 and you want it to access AWS S3 bucket. These are services. Now, and services interacting in AWS also still need permissions, and they need to log in, call it logging into them, or they need to have access to them. And what you do in that case is you give them roles. And that's where it's mostly used. You use IMI roles mostly when services are communicating to service, but also remember that users can also want to assume this to use this IMI role. And the good thing, the difference with an IMI role and IMI user is the keys for the IMI role are temporary, but when you're talking about IMI user, the keys are permanent. So that's what I just wanted to show there. And then regarding the policy, a policy is a JSON file used to set permissions. We have been talking about permissions, but where are they set? It's actually done on a policy. It's a JSON file. I think I have an example of that. So when you attach a policy to an identity or a resource, it will define the permissions it will have. Remember the part that you talk of an identity, we've talked about keys. Keys only grant access. They don't give, now, what after you gain access, what can you do? That's where the policies come in. Policies then define what you can do, which are permissions. So policies can deny or allow access to some particular resources. These are services and users. So a policy is always made up of an effect, that is allow or deny, an action, which is the permission, or a resource, and the resource here could be, yeah, an EC2 instance or an S3 bucket. So this graph, this small drawing here, try to link all of this together. So you have a policy sitting here. You can assign it to a role. Remember, policy is just a set of permissions. So we'll give them that role permissions. You can assign a policy to a user, and then that user will have the permissions that are stated on it. And you can assign a policy to a group, which we have said is good to use groups when you want to manage maybe hundreds of users or more. And then users belongs to a group, but you notice that groups don't. So this is the direction in which it flows. So for those who will easily capture that. And there's a link, if you notice in most of the videos, I have some links. There's a short training for 15 minutes here that just deals with IML role, users, policies. So if there's someone who still feels like they still need to go and look back into this very well, I highly recommend this short training. It's from AWS and it's very straight to the point, I would say. Yeah, this is an example of a JSON file for policy. So it's always written in this way. You don't really need to know this. I just wanted to show this that you should see as an example, but maybe that will help you recognize when you are talking of a policy, what that stands for. But yeah, it's always written something provided. Don't bother if you look at that and it's a bit complicated. Then now we've always come across different best practices when you are dealing with in the questions and in revision. It's required that you do multi-factor authentication for all the users you create, and you can do this with either a physical or a virtual device, and it generates a token for login. Anyone who did configure their account as we did recommend, you definitely go through this and you should remember what multi-factor authentication is all about. And then there's also the concept of least privilege access, which is a very important concept in the whole field of cloud and that has become even technology everywhere you go. And it lies on the fact that you should always grant a user just the required resources that he or she need, not more. So for a particular task, if they just need to read, grant the person read access. Don't grant read and write, because you open room for maybe the users to abuse those extra rights. So this privileged access is a very key principle when you are talking about IMI best practices. Is use rules for applications. So when you are dealing with applications, make sure that you use the rules, because rules, these are always temporary credentials. You don't want to do hard coding or configuring direct credentials on an application, because that is liable for maybe someone to come across them, maybe someone hacking and then you make use of that. So when you are thinking of rules, think of use rules when you want to give particular permissions to applications. Rotate your credentials regularly and remove unnecessary users and credentials. Yeah, this is very important. You can be auditing your resource, and if there is at one point there are um, users or credentials that you don't need, you should always delete them, unnecessary credentials. Monitor activity in your AWS account through the various monitoring services. Delete the root user access keys. Notice that is not delete the root account, is delete root user access keys, because that's one of the best practices you should follow. And then create a new account for yourself and assign it administrative access. So administrative access here is a policy for that user that will allow him or her to still carry out functions that are necessary for administering the account. So that's some key best practices. So group users with the same security requirements into a group and assign policies to the group. I think I've talked about that. Then the root account, that's what you use to log in your root user account using the email address you registered with. Yeah, just a comment there. Um, Now let's look into general security, identity and access management. Um, right. But I've grouped here some of the services that we meet into different parts. Like here, when you're talking about identity and access management, one that you come across is Amazon Cognito, which is used as identity management for your apps. If you don't know much about that service, I highly will recommend that you look into that again and make sure you are quite comfortable with it. But it's an identity management for your apps. AWS organization, central governance and management across AWS account. You can programmatically create a new AWS accounts and allocate resources, group accounts to organize your workflows. And you apply policies to accounts or groups or governance. Um, it simplifies billing because you are using a single payment method for all of your accounts. I think we have seen questions that try to figure out like which of the following is true about AWS organizations. And one of the key areas is the fact that despite the fact that you have so many accounts, payment can then come only through one single account. So this something I'll encourage that you make sure that you are aware of AWS organizations. When you are talking about security in the cloud, one of the things is dictation. What are the services that doing some kind of dictation on the cloud? Amazon Guard Duty, which is a managed street dictation services, and what it basically does is it monitors for malicious activity and unauthorized behavior to protect your AWS accounts, workloads, and data stored in Amazon S3. So the key thing here is a dictation service and monitors for malicious activity and unauthorized behavior on your account, workloads, and data stored on Amazon S3. That is completely different from what AWS Inspector will do because it's AWS Inspector is an automated security assessment service that helps improve the security and compliance of applications deployed on AWS. So when you are thinking of doing security assessment of applications deployed on AWS, you think of Inspector. When you are thinking of malicious activity and unauthorized behavior on your workloads, and this could be applications, you think of guard duty. Inspector will check for unintended network accessibility of your Amazon EC2 instances and for vulnerabilities on those EC2 access, EC2 instances. So take note, Inspector can be able to check for unintended vulnerabilities on your EC2 instances. So just make sure that you can see the difference here. One is monitoring malicious activity, and one is doing security assessment um, to help improve the security and compliance of applications. Then Amazon Config. I've placed this together with Amazon Cloud Trail because in our revision, we did finally figure out the difference. But Amazon Config here enables you to access, audit, and evaluate the configurations of your AWS resources. So you are assessing, you're doing an audit and evaluate the configurations of your AWS resources. You use this to determine if resource configuration complies against the configurations specified in your internal guidelines. So maybe an organization may have some specific guidelines that for every resource deployed on AWS, it has to follow 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So you then have that in Amazon config, and it will always do that assessment and evaluate and tell you if those resources are following those internal guidelines that you have. And then based on that, you can then figure out what you need to do. But CloudTrail enables governance, compliance, and operational auditing as well, and risk auditing. But in this case, it's looking into the AWS account. So it's in charge. AWS CloudTrail is more of monitoring the activity, what's happening in your AWS account. So, but as we see, config here, when it's doing compliance, is for the AWS resources. Now, security C, let's look at infrastructure protection. When you're thinking of protecting infrastructure, you have AWS Shield, which is a managed distributed denial of service protection service that safeguards applications running on AWS. There are two types of them. So it comes in two flavors. You have the AWS standard, Shield standard, and this one is free for all AWS accounts. And it offers some kind of quick dictation and actually defends against most common frequently occurring network and transport layer DDoS attacks that target your websites or applications. So um, Shield, the first thing you should know about AWS Shield, each time you hear of distributed denial of service, just start thinking of AWS Shield. That's the very first key thing. And then for the standard, you know that it's free and it just handles the most common frequent attacks. But then you have the advanced Shield, which is much more of an enhanced dictation, um, and it comes with an extra cost, and it's handled by a specialized support team. So if you want some, if the dictation mechanisms that exist in the standard, in the AWS Shield standard are not okay for you, you can then buy the AWS Shield Advanced, which comes with extra cost for enhanced dictation and advanced attack mitigations. So that's just basically all you need to know about that. Then you have WAF, and I really insist that make sure you have a good understanding of this. WAF is an application. It works at layer 7. It's a web application firewall, and it protects your web applications or APIs. These are some of the things we can always remember: the applications, but if they go and talk about APIs, you may start wondering. So make sure that you notice that it's not just protecting applications, it also protects your APIs. And the key things that it's always doing is blocking common attack patterns such as SQL injection or cross-site scripting. When you see a question and it's talking about SQL injection or cross-site scripting, just start thinking of WAF. And you can deploy it on Amazon CloudFront as part of your CDN solution. So WAF is always working in line with CloudFront when you are doing your when you are deploying your CDN solution. So those are the key things when you're talking about infrastructure protection. Then you have data key protection, and the key services are the AWS Key Management Service, KMS, key storage and management. You easily create and control the keys used to encrypt or digitally sign your data. And yeah, I've just made this brief. Yeah, we did touch the material and enough on our during our training on AWS KMS. So if you see a service and you feel like, okay, you don't still remember more, you can then look at that later. The other one is the cloud hardware security model, which is called Cloud HSM. It enables you to easily generate and create your own encryption keys on the AWS cloud. So with Cloud HSM, you can manage your own encryption keys. If you see a question and they start talking about hardware, I think we have seen a couple of them in our preparations. You need key rotations and then maybe cloud where you want to generate your own keys, and they talk of hardware. Just look into it carefully. The key, because what the secret about the question was, they will always give cloud HSM, and in the question they will talk about hardware. But if you understand the full meaning of cloud HSM, you immediately see that cloud HSM will be a good fit. So I encourage everyone to have that. Then data protection again, Amazon Messi. Apologies there, that should be C and not Z. I don't know how that come up, but yeah, I have it correct here. So it's meant to discover and protect sensitive data at scale. So it offers protection to personally identifiable information. Most of the time, the questions we have seen are trying to see if you understand where what this is, what are the key function. In the foundation level, you should be able to know what a service is and what it does. That's very, very key. So Amazon Music can automatically provide an inventory of Amazon S3 and use machine learning to identify and alert you to PII. The next one is Certificate Manager, which is for provision, manage, and deploy public and private SSL/TLS certificates. So, which is for data protection. And then you also have Secrets Manager, You see some of these services at times are always many and a bit confusing. So when the certificate manager there is for to provision, manage, and deploy public and private SSL and TLS certificates. But then you have the secrets manager, which is to rotate, manage, and retrieve secrets. It helps you protect secrets needed to access your applications, services, and IT resources. So when you're thinking of secrets that you need to access your application and services, um, this is the service that you will be looking into. Compliance. When you're talking of compliance, I think we've been mentioning this a lot. AWS Artifact comes online. It comes at no cost. It's a self-service portal for on-demand access to AWS compliance reports. Yeah, it provides an on-demand access to AWS security and compliance reports, so and you select online agreements. Just a repetition there, I think I did. When you're thinking of security and incidents, so when something happens, you have Amazon Dictative. It analyzes and visualizes security data to rapidly get to the root cause of potential security issues. That's just the service there. I think I was not too fast, but I'll stop here again. And if there is any question,